So we're looking around all the different sorts of shade in this garden, and we've looked at partial shade or part shade. We've looked at dappled shade. We're back in dappled shade again here, and deep shade. But what happens when you've got some shade and some problematic soil conditions? So under this tree here, we've raised up the level of the soil around this tree to try and overcome the problems that the tree roots are causing. But even though it's only dappled shade in here, this soil is incredibly dry, particularly as it's in a raised bed. So it's stony, it's dry. You could add lots and lots of compost to it, this bagged compost that we mentioned earlier, or your own homemade garden compost or soil improver, and that would really help. But moisture retention is a real problem here because it's raised, it's under a tree that's taking out a lot of moisture from the soil, and actually the added problem is here, rather than it being really dense shade, it's dappled shade, and you get enough sunlight to dry plants out and to dry the soil out. But what might be worth adding to the soil to actually get the plants to establish in the first place is some of this stuff, and this is a moisture retaining gel which you would normally use in hanging baskets or containers just for the summer. The good thing about this stuff is that it breaks down and disintegrates into the soil. It comes as dry granules, and then you wet it before you use it. So it goes into the soil wet. If you add it dry and then wet it afterwards, you'll find that it will heave up the soil. And what sort of plants would I put in here? Well, this is a really interesting and unusual little plant over here. This is Buglossoides, and it can get a little bit weedy in some locations if it's really got very, very good growing conditions. But here in this dry soil, it's very resistant and very resilient, and it has these beautiful blue flowers in the spring. We've also got over here, we've got already planted a really nice little geranium, an alpine geranium. They're very, very shade tolerant, surprisingly. And then, even though this is dappled shade and you might expect it to want full sun, this sedum here, really, or Hylotelephium as we should call them now, this is really doing well because it's getting enough light to keep it going, but it's really thriving in these dry, well-drained conditions here. And then what might surprise many of you is my headpiece on the top of my head, which isn't a hat, it's actually a tree peony. Tree peonies are very deep rooted, surprisingly robust, will tolerate quite dry soils once they're established, and make really nice height and lovely foliage, and can cope with dappled shade such as we're getting here. But I've also brought along a few other little plants that might work in this area. Remember we said earlier that it's a good idea to plant small plants so that they get really well established and then they can get away. So this is a Lamium maculatum. Get them well established and they'll make a nice carpet of foliage, beautiful silvery foliage, but then pinkish flowers as well in the summer. And then also that old favourite that I mentioned earlier, go back to something like the lungworts and the pulmonarias. Flower in the spring, but then these lovely spotty leaves throughout the summer will make a really nice carpet under here. You won't get any real rave reviews for your planting in any of these sorts of extreme conditions, but as long as you can keep the soil covered and you can get some sort of display at some time of the year, then it's worth looking at all sorts of options for planting in these dry soiled, shady conditions.